They hammered up the no fishing sign at dawn on Memorial Day, right when I was setting the table by the dock for my late wife's favorite breakfast. Name's Loyal Rusk. Been living on this lake longer than the HOA's been alive. Didn't raise my voice, just retrieved the old boundary map from my filing tin and pinned it beside their email ink still wet with their $200 a day threat. Funny how nobody noticed the small brass surveyor's tag by the cedar post, until it showed up on the projector in front of 60 people. Ever had someone overstep your line without checking whose boots are buried there first? One summer morning, I found a crisp white sign drilled into a cedar post by the edge of my lake no fishing. HOA, Regulation 4.3. I hadn't approved it, and I sure as hell didn't agree with it. The cedar post stood straighter than any in my shed fresh from the hardware store, its base jammed into earth that had belonged to my grandfather before the HOA even had a name. The screws were still bright. Whoever installed it hadn't wasted time, but they had wasted nerve. I crouched down beside it and ran my hand along the bottom of the post. The soil was loose. A sloppy job. Behind me, the morning mist clung to Dale Hollow Lake, the kind of mist that moves slow like it's still deciding whether to lift or settle in for the day. A hawk cried out somewhere above, tracing invisible loops in the sky. That sound always meant freedom to me, but today it felt like a warning. I didn't tear the sign out. That's not my style. Instead, I walked the length of our old dock boards, creaking under my boots, and sat at the edge for a while. The lake was glass. No wind, no current, just the kind of stillness that makes you listen deeper than usual. I thought of my grandfather's voice, gravelly and low, reading out loud from the deed papers when I was 12. If it's yours, treat it like it'll outlive you. He always did love a clean boundary line. An engine hummed behind me. I turned and saw Lacey Fremont pulling up in her powder blue truck, 2 styrofoam containers balanced on the passenger seat. I brought the catfish lunch early, she called, stepping out and shading her eyes. Figured you might be working the woodpile today. I smiled and waved her over. Lacey was in her 70s, but her knees moved like they remembered ballet. She set the containers down on a folding table near my porch, then followed me toward the dock. Halfway there, she stopped. Her eyes landed on the sign. "Well," she said, voice drawn tight, "I suppose it's official now." I looked at her. "Is it?" She shrugged. "They sent an email yesterday evening, said the lake is part of the Shared Environmental Asset Zone." My brow furrowed. That wasn't in any original charter. Lacey hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a printed email. Her hands were a little shaky as she unfolded the page and handed it to me. The subject line read, "Clarification of Community Water Feature Access. Immediate Notice." It didn't say much, but what it said was enough. Something about increased misuse, communal benefit, and standardization of recreational signage. A lot of words that meant nothing and everything at once. I nodded, then passed the page back. "They're trying to expand." Lacey pressed her lips together. "I always thought this was your water, Loyal, ever since I moved here. Your family's name's right there in the land records." "It still is," I said. "But I guess some folks need reminding." I spent the rest of the morning in the garage finding old cedar planks and a can of faded paint I'd used last fall. The letters took time, big, blocky, confident, but I knew how to write them straight. Before noon, I carried the new sign out with a mallet and 2 bolts. Private lake. Documentation on file. I planted it 3 feet down from theirs, facing outward from the same stretch of grass. As I tightened the bolts, I didn't speak. I didn't look around. I just worked slow and steady the way my grandfather taught me. Never rush a message you want remembered. Lacey stood nearby, arms crossed. She didn't say much either, but before she left, she touched my shoulder lightly. "That sign of yours," she said, "feels more honest than theirs ever will." Late that afternoon, I walked the lake edge again. That's when I saw them muddy boot prints, 4 of them sinking deep into the grass just before the dock. They weren't mine. They weren't from Lacey either. The treads were wide, fresh, and pointed straight toward the cedar post I hadn't installed. Someone had come early, real early, before the sun had burned off the mist, and they hadn't knocked. I took a photo of the boot prints on my phone, then zoomed in on the sign, no fingerprints, no logo, just a bold typeface, and that smug HOA, Regulation 4.3. I went inside, poured a lukewarm cup of yesterday's coffee, and sat by the window. An hour later, it came. Email from HOA admin@dalehollowhoa.org. Subject, urgent reminder to all residents. Residents are reminded that unauthorized signage near common water features will be removed. No greeting, no name, just a reminder. But I'd already written mine. Dad, I just checked the zoning maps. That lake's never been part of the HOA. Something's off, Callan said over the phone. He always opened with facts. No small talk. I heard his keyboard in the background, the soft click-click of legal fingers chasing something elusive through the state's land records. I leaned my elbow against the kitchen counter, cradling the cordless phone between cheek and shoulder, staring at a loaf of bread I'd forgotten to slice. You sure I asked? I pulled the 2017 boundary update from the county clerk's site. The HOA parcel line stops at the road. The lake's technically unincorporated belongs to you per the 1973 exception clause. I let that sit in the air a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass with a restless hiss. My kitchen still smelled of pine cleaner and black coffee. The morning sunlight streaked across the table, highlighting the grooves in the old wood like memory lines. Well, I said finally, they're building a case for something they don't own. Exactly, Callan replied. They're asserting soft authority. Public enough to scare people, quiet enough not to trigger a lawsuit. Classic HOA maneuver. I hung up after we agreed to exchange scans. I trusted Callan's instincts. He'd never been one for drama, and he read bylaws the way other men read novels. I turned toward the cabinet where I kept the family papers. The drawer groaned open, same as always, revealing a mess of file folders, rubber bands dried to cracking, and paper clips that had rusted together over time. I spent the better part of an hour sifting through layers, school photos, old electric bills, even a letter from my late wife tucked between gas receipts. Finally, I found what I was looking for, a tan folder labeled Deed, 1973, Orig, in my grandfather's thin handwriting. Inside was only a 2005 reprint, grainy smudged in the corners and missing the handwritten notations I knew used to be there. No seal, just black toner and a vague line that ran halfway down the edge of the page like a half-drawn border. I exhaled through my nose. It wasn't anger yet, just something deeper, slower. A tightening coil. That's when the inbox alert dinged on my laptop, from Marcia Vanglin, HOA President at DaleHollowHOA.org. Subject: Aesthetic Violations. Enforcement Notice. Dear homeowners. Please be advised that unauthorized signage near common water features is subject to a $200 day fine under Aesthetic Standard B3. We urge voluntary compliance before formal citations begin. Respectfully, HOA Board of Dale Hollow. So that's how they wanted to play it. I printed the email not in anger, but with precision. I underlined common water feature in red pen, drew a neat box around it, and pinned it to the wall above my desk right next to a blank square where the old map should have been. It looked like a shrine without its saint. A little while later, a soft knock sounded at the screen door. I opened it to find Lacey Fremont bundled in a summer shawl despite the heat, her eyebrows tight and mouth pursed in concern. I don't want to trouble you, Loyal, she said, stepping inside, but this morning they ticketed Paul's kayak. I blinked. Paul Jenkins lives 2 houses down from me. He left his kayak tied to a branch near the cove. They said it was improper shoreline anchoring. Gave him a $75 fine. I poured her a glass of lemonade and sat down across from her. They're calling it a community waterway, she said, voice trembling slightly. But we all know that water never belonged to the HOA, not even when I moved here in '91. They're testing thresholds, I murmured. She nodded. I'm worried about what comes next. After she left, I moved slowly, pulling open the lower desk drawers, spreading out every land survey and board memo I had. The cabin filled with paper edge-to-edge plat maps, ink-stained minutes from past HOA meetings, even a yellowed newsletter from 1995 announcing the adoption of a non-binding shoreline charter. Somewhere in that mess was the truth. But the thing about old documents, they don't shout. They whisper, and I had just begun to remember how to listen. As the sun fell, casting long amber streaks across the lake, I made myself a second cup of coffee, burnt and bitter, and sat at my desk. The email printouts formed a fan across the wall now, pointing in every direction, and none at all. One blank spot remained at the center, reserved for the original deed. That's when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps. I opened the door to find a woman I didn't recognize at first, small, wiry silver hair pinned neatly. A blue cardigan, buttoned wrong. She looked up with eyes the color of rainwater. "Mr. Rusk," she asked, her voice barely above the wind. I nodded. "This is from Reverend Pike," she said, handing me a sealed envelope with brittle edges. "Said you'd know what to do with it." Then she turned, walked back toward her rusted sedan, and drove away without another word. I stood in the doorway a long while before I closed it behind me. The envelope smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar, aged almost sacred in its stillness. Its flap had yellowed at the edges, sealed with a wavering line of wax that had cracked in transit. I sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from my chipped mug of black coffee, and held the thing like it might speak. Inside, folded with reverence and weight, was a map. Not a copy, not a scan, a hand-inked original creased in 4 brittle along the folds. I unfolded it slowly, laying it out flat between my elbows. The surface was dense with lines, some rigid, some hand-drawn, like someone had tried to capture every branch, every dip of shoreline. On the lower right, in faded fountain ink, 3 signatures curved across the margin: Ellery Pike. Notary, Public Dale Hollow County, Franklin Rusk. Landowner, Dale Hollow Registry. Certified 1973. Attached was a note, typed on yellowed stationery. Loyal. This is the original boundary map filed before the HOA even existed. Hold this until someone needs to remember who really owns the lake. EP. I leaned back, heart beating a little too fast for this early in the day. Outside the window, fog pressed low over the lake herons gliding just above the surface like gray prayers. The whole scene felt like memory cracking open. I called Callan. "You're up early," he answered. "I've got the 1973 original, certified, water rights included." Silence for a beat. Then, from where Reverend Pike? He sent it through a woman, Imogene Weathers. The church treasurer, Callan said, surprised. She used to handle filing for the senior housing petition. Same one. "Okay," he continued, shifting gears. "Scan it to me. I'll cross-reference signatures and compare clause language." I did as asked, flattening the map under 2 books and taking high-res photos section by section. The ink had bled slightly along the contours, but you could still make out the parcel lines and the handwritten annotation, shoreline exclusive to Parcel Rusk, grandfathered under Civic Exemption 1973. I uploaded the files and waited. 10 minutes passed. I reboiled the coffee. Then the phone buzzed. "It's valid," Callan said. "The clause predates the Dale Hollow HOA charter by 9 years. That shoreline's yours. Legally airtight." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "They've been bluffing," I murmured. "Not just bluffing," he replied. "They're building a false precedent. If nobody stops them, it becomes assumed authority." I hung up and walked out to the porch, the map still clutched in one hand. That's when I saw Imogene standing beneath the cedar tree, arms folded, eyes sharp behind silver-framed glasses. Her face held a mix of sadness and certainty. "Thank you for bringing this," I said. She nodded once. "Reverend Pike said you'd know how to use it." "Why now?" She looked out at the lake for a long moment before answering. "Because people forget. Because the HOA tried something like this before." I turned. "Before?" She nodded. 10 years back. The church filed for a small grant to build a playground for Sunday school. Nothing big. Just a swing set, mulch, a little fence. Marcia Vanglin led the opposition. Claimed it would disrupt shoreline tranquility. She rallied a vote. Shot it down, and Reverend Pike I asked. He said nothing publicly, she replied, but he started collecting documents, just in case. That envelope's been sitting in the church safe ever since. That was all she said before she turned and walked back toward the gravel lot where her car waited. No farewell, no sermon. Just the facts offered like a torch. Back inside, I unpinned the HOA's email still bearing the smug threat of fines and replaced it. In its place, I taped the 1973 map, smoothing each edge like handling an old photograph. The ink shimmered faintly in the light, each signature a little miracle of memory. The contrast between the map and the email was brutal. One hand-drawn and human, one printed and faceless. Sometimes the past is like dry tinder. All it needs is the right spark to burn through the lies. That night, as I reviewed the scans Callan sent back with his annotations and reference links, I noticed a second email in my inbox flagged in red. From Callan Rusk. Subject: "This just leaked inside," was a thread of internal HOA messages forwarded anonymously. The subject lines read like whispers behind closed doors. "Should we revisit the shoreline access narrative? Public good over legacy rights. Marcia, if we frame it as community amenity, we avoid direct challenge." I stared at the screen for a long time, the edges of the room blurring. So they weren't just mistaken, they were planning it all along. By midweek, my sign had company. A second one appeared bolted just above mine in the same cedar post. "This signage violates aesthetic ordinances. Fine $200 day. HOA Regulation B3. No signature, just another faceless decree printed in the same smug font as the first. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't take theirs down. I just went to the garage, flipped on the overhead light, and ran my hand across a plank of oak that had waited long enough. Oak takes time. It's stubborn, dense, and smells like wet earth when you cut into it. I sanded it until the grain came through like ripples on water, then pulled out the black outdoor paint I'd bought last fall but never used. Letters, bold and clean, bloomed under my brush. Private lake, no swimming, trespassers will be prosecuted. There was no anger in the strokes, just weight. The weight of names carved into deeds of oaths passed between generations over back porch coffee. Outside, dusk pressed against the windows. The smell of barbecue drifted in from someone's yard down the hill. My radio played a gospel tune so faint I could barely catch the words. That's how I liked it, company that didn't require conversation. I worked until full dark. Then I bolted the sign to the post above the HOA's latest threat, not next to it. I made sure the angle caught the porch light just right. The next morning, Marvin Stotts came knocking. He looked out of place in a polo shirt and slacks, sweat already blooming under his arms despite the mild heat. His eyes darted to the post before he said a word. "Morning, Mr. Rusk," he greeted, voice polite but brittle. I opened the screen door without smiling. "Marvin," he cleared his throat. "Marcia asked me to come by. She's concerned. Your sign, it's stirring things up. People are talking." "Good," I said. He blinked. "She's requesting it be removed. Voluntarily, for now." I didn't answer. Just walked to my desk and retrieved the manila folder Callan had overnighted. I opened it, took out the deed packet and held it out without a word. Marvin accepted it like it might bite him. "This is original boundaries, certified, including water rights dated 1973. Your HOA charter wasn't ratified until '82. He thumbed through the pages, eyes scanning fast but not settling anywhere. "She's going to say this is outdated." "She can say what she wants," I replied. "Truth doesn't expire." He looked up, lips parting like he wanted to protest, but then he closed the folder slowly and gave me a reluctant nod. "I'll let her know." I watched him walk back to his silver sedan, the folder hugged awkwardly against his chest. As he pulled away, I noticed Lacey and Imogene standing just beyond the tree line. They weren't hiding, but they weren't waving either, just watching. Word spread quick in Dale Hollow. By lunchtime, I'd seen at least 5 residents slow walk past the dock. They didn't say much. 1 or 2 offered a nod. One man snapped a photo of the sign with his phone pretending to be looking at the lake. The hush was heavier than noise. That evening, the certified letter came. Thick paper, embossed logo. Delivered with all the ceremony of a court summons. You are hereby required to attend a mandatory homeowners association meeting regarding regulatory non-compliance and signage violations. Date June 10. Location Dale Hollow. Community Hall. Attendance mandatory. I ran my thumb along the edge of the page, then reached for the calendar above the fridge. I circled the date in red pen, slow, deliberate. "Let's see who's really prepared," I muttered. The lake was still that night, but not quiet. The room was already packed when I walked in. Plastic folding chairs filled every inch of the community center. Ceiling fans churned overhead, doing nothing for the heat. The scent of starch and summer sweat clung to polyester shirts and stiff purses. Along the back wall, a row of elders sat like a jury, silent, composed with hands folded over canes and worn Bibles. Up front, a screen glowed pale blue. At its center, Dale Hollow Lake. A community opportunity. HOA, Strategic Access Committee, September 2022, Marcia Vanglin stood at the podium in a coral blazer, clicking her slides forward like a pastor pacing through Sunday lessons. And as we continue to evolve our shared spaces, we must remember that equitable access is the cornerstone of a thriving community. The lake, for example, represents not just beauty, but unity. I slipped into a back seat without a word. She kept talking. Charts, a drone photo, a proposed pier design labeled Phase 2 Shared Shoreline Development. No mention of deeds, no mention of me. I waited, patient as tree roots. When she reached slide 12, something about standardized signage harmonizing aesthetic zones. I stood. My voice didn't rise, but it carried. "May I have 5 minutes?" She blinked at me. "Mr. Rusk, this is the HOA's designated. I have documents relevant to this discussion." There was a pause. Marvin Stotts, seated at her right, looked uncertain but nodded once. "Fine," Marcia said, briefly. I walked to the front, slipped a USB from my pocket, and handed it to Marvin. "Project this." He inserted it into the laptop. The projector hummed. The slideshow blinked, then shifted. Up came the 1973 original map. Ink-lined, signed. Clear as day. The Rusk parcel, I said, pointing with a carpenter's pencil, was filed in 1973, 9 years before the Dale Hollow HOA existed. It includes full shoreline rights. Grandfathered under Civic Exemption Statute 6.14. This map has 3 certifying signatures. Murmurs rippled. A woman in the third row squinted at the screen, nudged her husband. I passed printed copies of the deed packet down the rows, one for each trustee, another stack for residents. "These are notarized scans," I said. Original was held by Reverend Pike, delivered to me this week by his treasurer, Imogene Weathers. Marcia stiffened, then forced a smile. "Mr. Rusk, while we respect your family's tenure here, the HOA operates under current municipal code, not legacy claims." Before I could respond, the door at the back creaked open. Callan walked in, tie-loose jacket over one shoulder. He crossed the room calmly and handed me a second USB. "Here's your closing act," he whispered. I turned to Marvin. One more file. Click. The slide changed. Subject: internal email chain. Dale Hollow, HOA snippets appeared in sequence. We need to shift the narrative from ownership to access. Marcia, if we lead with community equity, we avoid deed disputes. We frame it right, we don't need a legal win, we just outlast him. The room changed. No more shuffling, no more coughs, even the air conditioner seemed to hush itself. Marvin looked like he'd swallowed a tack. I wasn't aware of these communications," he said quietly. From the corner, Imogene stood. Neither were most of us. Then Lacey. "You tried this before, with the church playground." Eyes turned, backs straightened. Marcia's jaw set. "These emails are out of context." I raised my hand. "You don't have to like me," I said. Voice steady. "You don't have to wave when I pass your driveway. But you cannot take what's not yours. Not with emails, not with signs, not with silence." For a moment the room held its breath. Then from the back someone clapped. Just once, then twice more. Others followed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a standing ovation, but it was enough. Marcia leaned across the table toward me, voice a whisper only I could hear. "This isn't over, Mr. Rusk. I have lawyers." I didn't answer. I just reached down and clicked the projector remote one last time. The screen went black. The Dale County Sentinel ran the headline on a cool Thursday morning, "Who really owns the lake?" Subhead: Documents Challenge. HOA, Claim over Shoreline. Access. The print was still damp when I unfolded it beside my coffee. The smell of ink clung to my fingers like wet cedar bark. My mailbox, stuffed with rolled newspapers and flyers, now carried weight that wasn't just promotional. Truth had made it to the front page. That's when the dam broke. By lunchtime, the bulletin board at Dale Hollow's post office was covered in clippings, residents highlighting lines and yellow marker pinning handwritten notes to the margins. The article named names. It printed quotes. It included a scanned copy of the 1973 map, signed and notarized. And beneath it someone had tacked a post-it, "About time." That afternoon, Imogene called. "Turn on the radio," she said. "WDLH. I did. Static at first, then the clear voice of Reverend Pike. "No man owns a community," he was saying, "but every person holds a piece of truth. This lake has been misrepresented, not just to one man, but to all of us." I hadn't heard him preach since my father's funeral. His cadence hadn't changed, low deliberate, not asking for agreement so much as offering it, like communion. Later that day, Marvin Stotts resigned. His statement read at the end of the noon broadcast was short and scratchy. "I was misled. I apologize to Mr. Rusk and to this community. I no longer wish to serve under leadership that conceals intention." He left his position folded into a plain envelope taped to the HOA office door. No flourish, just walked away. That night I found Reverend Pike sitting at the diner counter halfway through a plate of meatloaf and green beans. I slid onto the stool beside him. "You always time your return so well?" I asked. He smiled into his coffee. "The Lord's punctual. I just follow." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cassette tape, slid it across the counter. "Listen to this. It's from a 2018 meeting, back when Marcia still thought power was a private thing." I blinked. "Does anyone still own a cassette player? I figured you might." At home, I dug out the old shoebox from the attic Dad's radio tools, some wires, and his dusty Sony cassette deck. I plugged it in, popped the tape. Marcia's voice filled the room, unmistakable. "We just need to get that lake under HOA's control. Once we do, we can build the amenities, raise fees. People will think it was always ours." A pause, a laugh. "Rusk doesn't even check his mailbox. He won't know what hit him." The tape hissed out as if gasping. I stared at the player for a long time, the whir of the reels slowing like a heart exhaling. Then I rewound the tape and locked it away in the safe right next to the deed packet. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. Residents started showing up at my porch. 47 in total, young old couples, widows. Some brought pie, others just envelopes with notes. "Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for making it clear." I'd forgotten what real boundaries looked like. I tacked each card to the barn wall, watching them bloom like a paper garden. And on Saturday, Imogene called again. "We're bringing back the church pavilion," she said. "Same design, same location. This time we'll build it with our own hands. No votes, no permission slips. I'll bring the planks I said." But not everything was celebration. Sunday morning, a manila envelope sat on my doorstep. No return address. My name typed in bold. Inside, 6 pages of legal threats. Phrases like defamation, injunctive relief, and cease and desist. All of it signed by a firm from Nashville on Marcia Vanglin's behalf. I read it once, then again. Then I walked to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and pulled out the same red pen I'd used on the HOA meeting date. I circled a new date: court mediation hearing October 12th. Fall was coming. The leaves had just begun to turn. And some things like trees or men only show their strength once the colors start to change. "The county just approved our petition," Callan said, stepping onto the porch with a grin that couldn't be hidden even if he'd tried. "We're taking back the HOA." I didn't say anything right away, just leaned back in my chair and let the words settle like warm coffee. The sun hadn't cleared the treetops yet, but already I could feel the air turning October light, softer than September whispering of endings and clean starts. "There's a vote next Thursday," he went on. "Marcia's out. You should have seen their faces when the county clerk stamped it approved in front of her." I smiled, not out of spite, but out of relief, the kind that doesn't shout it, exhales. At the Dale Hollow Town Hall, folding chairs once filled with tension now held neighbors passing around pecan bars and folded ballots. Some folks still dressed like they were coming from court. Others wore church denim and polos. The vote wasn't close. Marcia was removed not with yelling but with quiet ticking pens and nods from people who had seen too much. Reverend Pike stood at the end, hands behind his back. "Let this not be about winning," he said softly. "Let it be about repair." That's when Imogene stepped forward with a folded proposal. "The church pavilion," she said. "We've waited long enough. If this town can rewrite its rules, it can rebuild what it lost." Someone clapped, then another. The HOA's bylaws were amended that same evening, 2 lines clean and final. Pre-HOA property rights shall be preserved without exception. All development proposals shall be subject to public notice and vote. I didn't add anything. Didn't stand or wave or volunteer. At one point, someone nominated me for interim chair. I shook my head. Let someone younger carry the clipboard. Instead, I helped move tables. A few days later, we gathered behind the church at the clearing where the old pavilion once stood before rot and funding cuts turned it to dust. Someone brought chili. Another cornbread. Children ran between folding chairs while neighbors stacked planks and took measurements. I stood near the edge of the circle watching it all when Callan handed me something wrapped in a cloth. "Thought you'd want this." I unwrapped it slowly. My grandfather's hammer. Handle, worn smooth leather grip, cracked but solid. He'd used it to build the dock. The same one where the first sign had been posted. The one I nearly lost to bureaucracy wrapped in neighborly smiles. "Ready?" Imogene asked, holding out a cedar stake. I walked to the center of the lot, held the stake steady, then drove it down with a single, steady swing. The sound echoed not loud, but sure. Around me, heads nodded. Not to me, but to what the act meant. As the chatter returned and people resumed their work, I stepped aside, wiping my hands on an old rag. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, wandered over, watching me with cautious curiosity. "Did your family always own the lake, mister?" he asked. I looked at him, at his dusty sneakers and freckled nose, and smiled. "No," I said, "but we've always cared for it. That's different." He nodded like he understood more than he should. Spring returned like it always does in Tennessee, quiet at first, then suddenly, all at once, the cattails by the dock bent gently with the breeze. The lake shimmered under a pale blue sky, its surface smooth as brushed steel. Birds danced between branches. A fishing line zipped through the air and a chorus of kids' voices rose from the water's edge. I stood back from the crowd, hand resting on the newly carved sign, Private Lake, Community Respected, Esta 1973. The wood had been cut from the same oak plank as the first sign I'd hammered up nearly 3 years ago, but this one was smoother, softer at the edges. Letters painted by a teenager from the high school art club. She'd signed the back in pencil for Mr. Rusk. Thanks for holding the line. Behind me, the pavilion stood proud. Fresh cedar posts, tin roof catching morning light. Checkered tablecloths fluttered as folding chairs scraped over gravel. Someone had brought sweet tea in a mason jar the size of a paint bucket. Kids dipped their hands in coolers of ice. Laughter broke like waves. Callan found me by the dock. "Big turnout," he said, nudging my shoulder. "They say this is the most peaceful HOA in the county now." "Don't jinx it," I muttered. He handed me a small gift wrapped in brown paper folded tight like a lunch sandwich. "It's from Lacey. Found it in her attic." I unwrapped it slowly. A photograph. Faded, sepia-toned edges curled. My grandfather, Caleb Rusk, standing by the lake, one boot propped on a stump. In his hands, the original boundary map, wide open. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were clear, determined, younger than I'd ever seen him. There was no caption, just a crease across the middle like it had been folded and carried in someone's pocket for a long, long time. I walked to the pavilion, found a small nail, and tacked the photo to the inner wall right between the potluck sign-up sheet and a corkboard labeled Community Notices. People paused to look, then nodded, then moved on. That felt right. Later, I sat at the end of the dock, knees bent, palms flat behind me. Reverend Pike walked by, giving a small wave. A few new HOA members were helping stack chairs, their sleeves rolled up, laughter easy. The church kids had started fishing again. A scrawny boy in overalls squealed as he reeled in a flopping speckled bass. He held it high like a trophy. "He's big, Mr. Rusk," he yelled. I grinned. "The fish are smart around here," I said. "They know what's worth fighting for." He laughed, then ran to show his mother. I looked out over the lake. The trees cast long shadows across the water. The sign stood firm in the grass. The photo of my grandfather rustled once in the breeze, then settled. And, for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to guard anything. Just to remember it, and let it stand. The lake didn't say much that morning, just shimmered beneath a clear sky, while the new sign stood quiet, firm, and finally respected. The wood, once weathered by conflict, now carried laughter in its grain and handprints sticky with lemonade. I've learned that holding your ground doesn't always mean standing louder. Sometimes it's just about staying long enough to see the water settle. Boundaries matter not because they keep people out, but because they remind us what's worth protecting within. And sometimes what's broken isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone to mend it right. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story below or stick around. We've still got more fish tales to tell. The smell of fresh-cut grass and lake mist still clings to early spring mornings out here. That new wooden sign, carved, clean, sealed smooth, catches sunlight in a way the old one never did. It doesn't shout for attention. It simply belongs. I've come to believe that justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it's a faded photo nailed quietly to a wall, or a child catching a fish where peace was once broken. Sometimes the legacy we leave is the line we refuse to let them redraw. Have you ever stood your ground not for pride, but for something deeper? Share your story in the comments, or just sit with mine a while longer.